defender of his people. May grace and peace be multiplied to you through wisdom, courage, and truth. I received your letter not as a political communique, nor as a demand echoing through diplomatic channels. I received it as a cry of the soul, powerful, principled, and painful, from a son of the continent that has known too much loss, too much silence, and too many broken promises. I have read your words, not once, but many times, and each reading pierced deeper than the last, for in your voice I heard not merely the anger of a president, but the righteous cry of a continent, long wounded by the dual blades of neglect and exploitation. Let me begin now with defense, but with confession. Yes, the church has, at moments in history, stood beside colonizers, when it should have stood beside the crucified. There were chapters, some long, some shamefully brief, where the mission of salvation became entangled in the machinery of subjugation, where the banner of the cross was hoisted beside flags of empire, and the teachings of Christ were diluted by the ambitions of kings. For these sins of omission and commission, I bow my head in repentance. No institution, however sacred, is above self-examination, and if the church is to remain a beacon, it must not only shine light outward, it must shine it within. You ask, will this papacy be different? And to that I reply, not only will it be different, it must be. For too long the African voice has been heard only in whispers. Your leaders have been praised only when they were pliable, and demonized when they dared to defy unjust systems. Your resources have been extracted while your people will have to scavenge what was theirs to begin with. But Africa is not a charity case. Africa is not a patient waiting for the West to administer spiritual or political anesthesia. Africa is the cradle of courage, the wellspring of song, the pulse of prophecy. It is not the world's burden, it is its teacher. Let me speak plainly, as you did, President Traore, on colonial legacy. President Traore, you spoke of chains not only of those that bound the bodies of our ancestors, but the invisible ones that still clutch at the soul of Africa. Let us speak truth, not as adversaries, but as men burdened with memory. Colonialism was not simply a political conquest. It was a spiritual betrayal. It was not just the theft of land, but the attempted erasure of identity. Entire civilizations, with their poetry, their proverbs, their cosmologies, their sacred rhythms, were silenced under foreign flags and foreign gods. The missionaries, some sincere, came with crosses in one hand, but behind them followed gunboats, traders, and governors with contracts of domination. Baptismal fonts were built next to whips. Scriptures were preached beside swords. The story of Christ, who came to liberate, was too often retold in the language of control, and though many of those missionaries gave their lives in service, and some stood up to the powers of empire, the broader truth remains. The church did not always stand with the oppressed. Too often it stood with the conqueror. I confess this not as a political calculation, but as a moral reckoning. Because if the church is to truly mirror Christ, then it must weep where Christ would weep. And surely he weeps for what was done in his name on African soil. I have seen the ruins of colonial prisons turned into schools. I have met grandmothers who remember their tribes being renamed. I have watched as young African seminarians ask, is this faith ours, or was it imported? Let me answer clearly, the gospel was never meant to conquer. It was meant to liberate. Christ was never a colonizer. He was a carpenter from Nazareth, brown-skinned, occupied, poor. And so I pledge that under this papacy we will revisit our history, not to dwell in guilt, but to root out denial, not to perform penance with words, but to open doors with justice. The church must become not a reminder of conquest, but a refuge for cultural rebirth. let the next chapter be one written together by African hands in African languages and in full ownership of faith that was never truly foreign but always somehow destined to rise again from African soil. On economic injustice, President Traore, when you speak of blood-stained minerals and hunger in the shadow of gold mines, you are not exaggerating. You are revealing a wound that the world has chosen to dress with silence. Africa is rich, yet too many of her children remain poor. Why so? Because the wealth beneath your soil, cobalt, gold, uranium, coltan, oil, has been turned into a curse, not a blessing. These were supposed to be gifts of providence, not instruments of plunder. But instead of building schools, they have built empires far from the shores of Africa. Let us no longer pretend that